The morning sun of May 4th, 1940, to cast long shadows across the azure waters of the Coral Sea. But beneath its deceptively peaceful surface, the machinery of war was already churning. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher stood on the bridge of the USS Yorktown, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he studied the intelligence reports that had arrived just hours before dawn. The Japanese were coming, and this time, they meant to strike at the very heart of the Allied Pacific Defense Line. The Imperial Japanese Navy had tasted victory after victory since Pearl Harbor. Hong Kong had fallen, Singapore had crumbled, and the Dutch East Indies lay in Japanese hands like scattered pearls. Now, Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue commanded Operation Mo, an ambitious plan to seize Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea and extend Japanese control over the entire Coral Sea region. What made this operation different from previous Japanese advances was not just its strategic importance, but the revolutionary nature of the naval forces arrayed to contest it. For the first time in naval history, the major fleets would engage in battle without their surface ships ever coming within sight of each other. The age of the battleship, that mighty steel leviathan that had ruled the seas for centuries, was about to give way to a new form of warfare. Aircraft carriers, floating air bases carrying squadrons of dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters would determine the outcome of this engagement. The Battle of the Coral Sea would mark the dawn of a new era in naval combat. Fletcher commanded Task Force 17, built around the USS Yorktown and supported by the heavy cruisers USS Astoria, USS Chester, and USS Portland, along with 6 destroyers. Moving to join him was Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch's Task Force 11, centered on the USS Lexington, accompanied by the heavy cruisers USS Minneapolis and USS New Orleans, with 5 destroyers providing escort. The combined American force represented the largest concentration of carrier power the United States Navy had assembled since the war began. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's authoritative History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, the intelligence breakthrough that allowed the Americans to position their forces came from codebreakers who had partially cracked the Japanese naval cipher. The Japanese force was formidable in its own right. The striking force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi, included the heavy carriers Shokaku and Zuokaku, veteran ships that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. These carriers embarked some of Japan's most experienced pilots, men who had honed their skills in the crucible of combat across the Pacific. Supporting them were the heavy cruisers Myoko and Haguro, along with 6 destroyers. Additionally, the light carrier Shoho would provide air support for the invasion convoy approaching Port Moresby. As the opposing fleets maneuvered through the vast expanse of the Coral Sea, neither side initially knew the exact location of their enemy. The battle would be fought as much by intelligence gathering and reconnaissance as by the bombs and torpedoes carried by the aircraft. Both Fletcher and Takagi understood that whoever found the enemy first would likely strike the decisive blow. The stakes could not have been higher. For the Japanese, success would mean cutting the supply lines between the United States and Australia, potentially forcing the Australians out of the war and securing Japan's southern flank. For the Americans, defeat would mean the loss of Australia as a base of operation and would leave the Japanese free to threaten New Zealand and possibly even the west coast of the United States. May 5th, 1940 to dawn gray and overcast across the Coral Sea, with scattered rain squalls reducing visibility and creating perfect conditions for naval forces to maneuver unseen. The weather seemed to mirror the uncertainty both commanders felt as they groped blindly across the ocean, searching for an enemy they knew was near, but could not locate. Admiral Fletcher had positioned his combined task force approximately 400 miles southeast of Port Moresby, while Admiral Takagi's striking force prowled the waters northeast of the American position. The morning brought the first contact when a Hudson bomber from the Royal Australian Air Force spotted Japanese ships moving south through the Louisiade archipelago. The pilot's excited radio transmission crackled through the static. Large enemy force including carriers spotted bearing 200 degrees from Port Moresby. However, in the confusion of battle reporting, the message became garbled, leading Fletcher to believe he had located Takagi's main carrier force, rather than the support group for the Port Moresby invasion. Lieutenant Commander William Ault, commanding bombing squadron from the Lexington, led the first American strike of the battle. 15 Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers roared off the flight deck in the pre-dawn darkness, their engines straining under the weight of 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. Following them came 13 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Torpedo Squadron 2. their crews knowing they flew aircraft that were already obsolescent, but still deadly in the right hands. The American pilots found their targets in the protected anchorage near Mizuma Island. The light cruiser Tenryu, several destroyers, and 3 converted merchant vessels serving as transports. The attack was swift and brutal. All dive bombers screamed down from 8,000 feet, their sirens wailing as they plummeted toward the Japanese ships. The transport Koemaru took to direct hits and began listing heavily to starboard, black smoke pouring from her superstructure. But the most significant target that morning was the destroyer Kikazuki, caught at anchor while taking on supplies. Lieutenant John Powers, flying an SBD from the Yorktown, put his bomb directly through the destroyer's forward magazine. The explosion that followed lifted the ship's bow completely out of the water. Before she settled back, broken and sinking, the Kikazuki would be the first Japanese warship sunk in the Battle of the Coral Sea. But she would not be the last. Meanwhile, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were conducting their own search patterns, flying sector searches from their carriers in hopes of locating the American task force. At 0815 hours, a Kawanishi flying boat reported spotting the carriers and for heavy cruisers south of the Louisiade Islands. Like their American counterparts, the Japanese pilots had made an identification error, spotting the destroyer USS Sims and the fleet oiler USS Neosho, and mistaking them for much larger vessels. Vice Admiral Takagi immediately ordered a full-strike launch from both Shokaku and Zuikaku. 78 aircraft took to the skies, 36 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, 24 Nakajima B-5 NK torpedo bombers, and 18 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters providing escort. The Japanese pilots flew with the confidence born of months of victory, expecting to find the main American carrier force and deliver a crippling blow. What they found instead were the hapless Sims and Neosho, struggling through heavy seas as the oiler attempted to refill the destroyer. The attack was devastating in its ferocity, but tragic in its waste. The Sims took 7 direct hits and sank within minutes, taking most of her crew with her. The Neosho, her tanks full of aviation gasoline, somehow survived multiple bomb and torpedo hits, though she was left dead in the water and burning. Naval aviation expert Barrett Tillman, in his comprehensive study, The Dauntless Dive Bomber of World War II, notes that this mutual case of mistaken identity would prove costly for both sides, as precious aircraft and pilots were expended against secondary targets while the main enemy forces remained unlocated. By evening of May 5th, both sides had drawn first blood, but neither had located their primary objective. The real carrier battle still lay ahead, and both Fletcher and Takagi knew that the next day would likely bring the decisive engagement they both sought and feared. The 6th of May, 1940 brought clearer skies to the Coral Sea, and with better weather came improved visibility for reconnaissance aircraft from both fleets. Admiral Fletcher had spent the night maneuvering his task force northward, hoping to close the distance with the Japanese carriers while remaining beyond the range of their search aircraft. His gamble was about to pay off in spectacular fashion. At 0615 hours, Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, flying a Douglas SBD Dauntless from scouting squadron to aboard the USS Lexington, spotted the Japanese invasion convoy approximately 100 miles northwest of his position. But more importantly, he identified what appeared to be a small aircraft carrier operating with the convoy. Dixon's excited voice crackled over the radio, scratched one flat top. Large enemy ships bearing 010 degrees, distance 180 miles. The carrier Dixon had spotted was the Shoho, a converted passenger liner carrying 21 aircraft and serving as air support for the Port Moresby invasion force. Captain Kamishio Izawa commanded the small carrier, knowing his ship was vulnerable, but confident that his location remained secret from American search planes. That confidence was about to be shattered by 93 American aircraft converging on his position. Fletcher wasted no time ordering a full strike from both his carriers. From the Yorktown came 18 SBD dive bombers, 12 TBD torpedo planes, and 6 Grumman F Wildcat fighters. The Lexington contributed 22 dive bombers, 11 torpedo planes, and 9 fighters. Leading the attack was Commander William Ault from the Lexington and Lieutenant Commander Joe Taylor from the Yorktown, both veteran pilots who understood the importance of coordinating their attack to overwhelm the enemy's defenses. The American strike force approached the Japanese convoy into waves, with the faster dive bombers arriving first. The Shoho's combat air patrol consisted of only 6 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. Hopelessly outnumbered by the approaching American aircraft, Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi, leading the Japanese fighters, radioed desperately for help. but the nearest Japanese carriers were too far away to provide immediate assistance. At 0900 hours, Lieutenant Commander Taylor's dive bombers pushed over into their attack runs. The Yorktown's SBDs came screaming down from 12,000 feet, their pilots aiming for the Shoho's flight deck and hangar spaces. The first bomb, dropped by Lieutenant John Powers, struck the carrier just after her island's superstructure, punching through the flight deck and exploding in the hangar among fuel and armed aircraft waiting to launch. The explosion that followed was visible for miles. Aviation gasoline and ordnance detonated in a chain reaction that gutted the carrier's interior. Within minutes, the Shoho was transformed from an efficient fighting ship into a floating inferno. Her flight deck, twisted and blackened by the internal explosions, could no longer operate aircraft. Commander All's Lexington pilots arrived just as the Yorktown bombers were completing their runs. Seeing the carrier already badly damaged, they concentrated their attack on the heavy cruiser Furutaka and several destroyers escorting the convoy. The torpedo planes, flying low and straight through intense anti-aircraft fire, managed to put two torpedoes into the Shoho's starboard side below the waterline. According to the official U.S. Navy battle report filed by Admiral Fletcher and preserved in the National Archives, the attack on the Shoho represented the first time American carrier aircraft had sunk an enemy aircraft carrier in combat. Captain Izawa fought desperately to save his ship, ordering counterflooding to correct the list and directing damage control parties to fight the fires consuming his vessel. But the damage was too extensive. At 0935 hours, he gave the order to abandon ship. The Shoho rolled over and sank stern first, taking 631 of her crew with her. Only 203 survivors were rescued by the escorting destroyers. Lieutenant Commander Dixon, circling overhead to observe the results of the attack, made the radio call that would become legendary in American naval aviation, "Scratch one flat top." His jubilant transmission was heard by pilots throughout the task force, and news of the victory spread quickly through both carriers. The sinking of the Shoho marked a significant tactical victory for the Americans, but it also served notice to the Japanese that their carriers were not invulnerable. More importantly, it forced Admiral Inoue to postpone the invasion of Port Moresby until his forces could deal with the American carrier threat. The troop ships turned back toward Rabaul, giving Fletcher time to position his forces for the decisive battle that everyone knew was coming. As the sun set on May 6th, both sides prepared for what would be the climactic engagement of the battle. The Japanese still possessed two large, modern carriers with experienced air groups, while the Americans had proven they could find and sink enemy carriers. The stage was set for the first carrier versus carrier duel in naval history. May 7th, 1940 dawned with both carrier forces actively searching for each other across the vast expanse of the Coral Sea. The preliminary skirmishes were over. Now came the main event that would determine not only the fate of Port Moresby, but potentially the entire course of the Pacific War. Admiral Takagi, smarting from the loss of the Shoho and the postponement of the invasion, was determined to locate and destroy Fletcher's carriers before they could inflict further damage on Japanese operations. The morning search began before dawn, with both sides launching reconnaissance aircraft and carefully planned search patterns. From the Shokaku and Zuikaku came Nakajima B-5 Cape bombers. Converted for scouting duties, their crews trained to identify ship types at extreme ranges. The Americans countered with their SBD Dauntless dive bombers, equally capable of reconnaissance and attack missions. At 0815 hours, the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Junior Grade Joseph Smith, flying an SBD from the USS Lexington, spotted the wakes of the Japanese striking force cutting through the blue waters approximately 175 miles northeast of the American position. Smith's radio crackled with excitement. Enemy carriers bearing 020 degrees, distance 175 miles, course south, speed 25 knots. Almost simultaneously, a Japanese reconnaissance plane from the Shokaku radioed its own sighting report. Petty Officer First Class Kenzo Kano reported enemy force including the carriers, bearing 180 degrees, distance to 100 miles. For the first time in naval history, opposing carrier forces had each located their primary target, setting the stage for a mutual exchange of devastating air strikes. Admiral Fletcher immediately ordered a full deckload strike from both his carriers. The USS Yorktown contributed 15 SBD dive bombers, 12 TBD torpedo planes, and 6 FRF fighters. The USS Lexington launched 22 dive bombers, 11 torpedo planes, and 9 fighters. In total, 75 American aircraft headed northwest toward their historic rendezvous with the Japanese. fleet, Vice Admiral Takagi countered with his own massive strike force. From the Shokaku came 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, 16 B-5N torpedo planes, and 9 A-6M0 fighters. The Zuikaku added 15 dive bombers, 8 torpedo planes, and 8 fighters. 69 Japanese aircraft formed up and headed south, passing the northbound American strike somewhere over the empty ocean between the opposing fleets. The American pilots, led by Lieutenant Commander William Ault from the Lexington and Lieutenant Commander Joe Taylor from the Yorktown, flew through scattered cloud cover that hampered navigation but also provided concealment from Japanese patrol fighters. As they approached the reported position of the enemy carriers, they encountered the same weather front that had complicated earlier operations: thick clouds and intermittent rain squalls that made target identification difficult. Military historian Gordon Prange, in his detailed analysis Miracle at Midway, noted that weather conditions throughout the Coral Sea engagement played a crucial role in determining the timing and effectiveness of air strikes from both sides. At 10:30 hours, the American scout bombers spotted the Japanese fleet spread out below them in defensive formation. The Shokaku and Zuikaku steamed approximately 10 miles apart, surrounded by their screening vessels, the heavy cruisers Myoko and Haguro, along with 6 destroyers throwing up a curtain of anti-aircraft fire. Both carriers had aircraft spotted on their flight decks, preparing to launch additional strikes or combat air patrol fighters. Lieutenant Commander Taylor, coordinating the attack, decided to concentrate his bombers against the Shokaku, while the torpedo planes would divide their attention between both carriers. The decision reflected sound tactical doctrine: damage one carrier severely rather than spread the attack and achieve only minor damage to both targets. The dive bombers pushed over at 10:45 hours, screaming down through the flak with their 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. The Shokaku's Captain Takatsugu Yojima threw his ship into a series of radical turns, creating a foaming wake as he tried to avoid the plunging aircraft. Several bombs fell close alongside, sending geysers of seawater cascading over the flight deck, but the first wave of attackers failed to achieve any direct hits. The torpedo planes, approaching low and slow through the murderous crossfire from the screening vessels, had better luck. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, leading torpedo squadron from the Lexington, brought his antiquated TBD Devastators in from the starboard side of the Zuikaku. The Japanese carrier turned toward the attackers, presenting her narrowest profile. But one torpedo found its mark, exploding against the carrier's hull with a tremendous crash that shook the entire ship. However, it was Lieutenant John Powers, the same pilot who had sunk the destroyer Kikazuki 2 days earlier, who achieved the most significant hit of the attack, diving his SPD almost vertically toward the Shokaku's flight deck. Powers held his approach until he was barely 1,000 feet above the carrier. Before releasing his bomb, the weapon struck the flight deck near the forward elevator and penetrated to the hangar deck, before exploding among fueled aircraft. The damage to the Shokaku was severe, but not fatal. Her flight deck was holed and twisted, making aircraft operations impossible. But her hull remained intact and her engines continued to function. Captain Yojima would be able to retire from the battle, but his carrier could launch no more aircraft against the American fleet. While American bombers were pounding the Japanese carriers, the enemy's own strike force was approaching Task Force 17 with deadly intent. Commander Kakuichi Takahashi, leading the combined air groups from Shokaku and Zuikaku, had spotted the distinctive silhouettes of the USS Lexington and USS Yorktown steaming in formation with their escorts approximately 200 miles south of his own carriers. At 1100 hours, radar operators aboard both American carriers detected the incoming Japanese strike at a distance of 70 miles. The proximity of the enemy aircraft triggered immediate alarm bells throughout both task forces. Admiral Fletcher ordered his ships to general quarters while launching every available fighter to intercept the approaching bombers. 23 Grumman F-4F Wildcats roared off the flight decks, their pilots knowing they faced some of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch, leading Fighting Squadron 3 from the Yorktown, positioned his fighters to intercept the Japanese formation as it approached from the northeast. His pilots had been practicing a new tactical formation called the Thatch Weave, designed to counter the superior maneuverability of the Zero fighter. Today would mark its first major test in combat. The Japanese strike force arrived over the American task force in perfect formation. Despite having flown through weather fronts and navigational challenges, the 18 Val dive bombers climbed to 14,000 feet to begin their attack runs. while the 24K torpedo bombers split into two groups to attack the carriers from different directions. 9-0 fighters provided top cover, ready to engage any American interceptors. The air battle that followed was furious and chaotic. Thatch's Wildcats tore into the Japanese formation, their 650 caliber machine guns chattering as they engaged the enemy fighters. The Thatch weave proved its worth as American pilots used mutual support and coordinated maneuvers to overcome the individual superiority of the Zero. Lieutenant Noel Gaylor shot down devils in quick succession, while Ensign John Lepla added a 0 to his score. Despite the fierce resistance from American fighters and anti-aircraft guns, the Japanese pilots pressed home their attacks with characteristic determination. The first target was the USS Lexington, her massive flight deck making her an attractive target for the dive bombers. Captain Frederick Sherman threw his 33,000-ton carrier into a series of radical turns, but the ship's size worked against her in the confined waters where the battle was taking place. At 0:11:20 hours, the first Japanese bomb struck the Lexington's port side near the forward elevator. The 1,000-pound weapon penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, starting fires among the aircraft stored there. A second bomb hit moments later, this one striking the superstructure and causing significant damage to the carriers. Communications equipment. According to the detailed damage assessment compiled by the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships and preserved in the National Archives, the Lexington's initial damage was manageable and did not threaten the ship's survival, but it was the torpedo attack that proved most dangerous. Lieutenant Commander Shikakazu Shimazaki led 8K bombers in a coordinated attack. On the Lexington's port side, the American carrier's defensive maneuvers had positioned her perfectly for the torpedo planes, which approached in a classic anvil formation designed to ensure hits regardless of the target's evasive action. Two torpedoes struck the Lexington's port side, exploding below the waterline with tremendous force. The impacts opened large holes in the carrier's hull, and seawater began flooding into several compartments. The ship developed a 7-degree list to port, though her damage control teams immediately began counterflooding to correct the situation. The USS Yorktown, meanwhile, was under attack from a separate group of dive bombers. Captain Elliot Buckmaster maneuvered his carrier with skill and determination, turning into the wind to launch additional fighters while simultaneously evading the plunging bombers. His ship's smaller size and greater maneuverability served her well in the desperate minutes of the attack. One bomb struck the Yorktown's flight deck near the island's superstructure, penetrating to the fourth deck before exploding. The blast killed or wounded 66 men and started fires in several compartments, but the carrier's damage control organization quickly contained the damage. Within an hour, the Yorktown was operating aircraft normally, proving the value of good design and excellent training. As the Japanese strike force withdrew toward their own carriers, both sides assessed their losses and damage. The Americans had lost 3 fighters and suffered significant damage to the Lexington, while the Japanese had lost 9 aircraft, including several irreplaceable veteran pilots. More importantly, the battle had demonstrated that American pilots and ships could stand up to the best the Imperial Japanese Navy could offer. Commander Takahashi, leading the Japanese withdrawal, radioed his carriers with a mixed report. The Americans had been hit and hurt, but both carriers remained operational. The decisive blow that would eliminate the U.S. Navy's carrier force in the Pacific had not been struck. The afternoon of May 8, 1940 found both carrier forces withdrawing from each other, their commanders assessing damage and planning their next moves. Aboard the USS Lexington, Captain Frederick Sherman supervised damage control efforts while his crew fought to save their ship. The morning's torpedo and bomb hits had caused significant damage, but the carrier remained operational and capable of launching aircraft. However, deep within the ship's bowels, a far more dangerous threat was developing. Aviation gasoline vapors from ruptured fuel lines had begun accumulating in several compartments below decks. The Lexington's original design as a battle cruiser conversion included extensive fuel storage systems that, while providing great range and endurance, created vulnerabilities that newer carriers had been designed to avoid. Chief Machinist Mate Clarence Dickin and his damage control teams worked frantically to pump out flooded compartments and repair the ruptured fuel lines, but the volatile vapors continued to build to dangerous levels. At 11:58 hours, while the crew was beginning to believe they had saved their ship, a massive internal explosion rocked the Lexington from stem to stern. The accumulated gasoline vapors had found an ignition source, probably from electrical equipment damaged in the morning's attack. The explosion was so violent that it lifted the forward elevator completely out of its well. and threw it against the carrier's island superstructure. Commander Healy from the Damage Control Central reported to Captain Sherman, "Skipper, we've got uncontrollable fires on the second and third decks. The forward magazines are heating up, and we're losing pressure in the fire mains." The explosion had wrecked the ship's internal damage control systems and started fires that quickly spread through several decks. Naval constructors' reports filed after the battle, as documented in the official U.S. Navy Bureau of Ships War Damage Report, indicated that the Lexington's loss was primarily due to her early design features rather than the effectiveness of Japanese weapons. Admiral Fletcher, watching from the bridge of the Yorktown, faced one of the most difficult decisions any naval commander can make. The Lexington was clearly doomed, her fire spreading out of control and her magazines in danger of exploding, but she still carried nearly 3,000 men, and the process of evacuating such a large crew while under potential enemy attack required careful coordination. Captain Sherman, understanding his ship's condition better than anyone, made the decision that saved most of his crew. At 14:20 hours, he passed the word, "All hands prepare to abandon ship." The order was given calmly and professionally, reflecting the high standards of training and discipline that characterized the U.S. Navy even in the darkest moments of the war. The evacuation of the Lexington proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Sailors helped wounded shipmates to the flight deck, where destroyers USS Phelps, USS Dewey, and USS Hammond moved alongside to take off survivors. The carrier's executive officer, Commander Morton Seligman, supervised the evacuation while ensuring that classified materials and important equipment were either removed or destroyed. Lieutenant Commander Pop Healy, the ship's damage control officer, made one final inspection of his beloved carrier before leaving, moving through smoke-filled passages and checking compartments. Where fires still raged, he ensured that no living sailor remained aboard. His devotion to duty exemplified the spirit of the men who served in the U.S. Navy's darkest hour. At 17:07 hours, with all survivors safely off the ship, Admiral Fletcher made the painful decision to scuttle the Lexington to prevent her possible capture or use by enemy forces. The destroyer USS Phelps was ordered to torpedo the burning carrier. Lieutenant Commander David White, the Phelps commanding officer, positioned his ship 500 yards from the Lexington and fired 5 torpedoes into her starboard side. The explosions from the torpedoes triggered a final, massive detonation as the Lexington's remaining aviation gasoline and ammunition stores went up simultaneously. The blast was visible for miles, sending a column of flame and smoke thousands of feet into the air. The ship that her crew had called Lady Lex disappeared beneath the waves at 19:56 hours, taking with her the hopes and dreams of the men who had served aboard her. Despite the tragic loss of their carrier, the Lexington's air group had performed magnificently throughout the battle. Her pilots had sunk the Shoho, damaged the Shokaku, and proven that American naval aviation could match the best Japan could offer. Of the ship's crew of nearly 3,000 men, 2,735 were rescued by the escorting destroyers, a testament to the effectiveness of damage control training and the courage of the men who served. As news of the Lexington's loss spread through the fleet, it was tempered by the knowledge that the battle had achieved its primary objective. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby had been turned back, Australia remained secure, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had learned that American carriers could fight and die hard. The age of easy Japanese victories in the Pacific was coming to an end. The morning of May 9th, 1940 found the opposing fleets separated by hundreds of miles of empty ocean, both commanders taking stock of what history would record as the first carrier versus carrier battle in naval warfare. Admiral Takagi, with the Shokaku badly damaged and unable to operate aircraft, began his withdrawal to Ward Truck, while Admiral Fletcher, having lost the Lexington but with the Yorktown still operational, steamed southeast toward Pearl Harbor and repairs. The immediate tactical results of the Battle of the Coral Sea appeared to favor the Japanese. They had sunk a large American aircraft carrier and inflicted significant casualties, while losing only the light carrier Shoho and several smaller vessels. Japanese newspapers proclaimed a great victory, and Admiral Yamamoto's staff began planning their next operation with confidence that American carrier strength had been significantly reduced. However, the strategic implications of the battle told a very different story. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, a major Japanese offensive had been stopped cold. The invasion convoy bound for Port Moresby had turned back to Rabaul, leaving that crucial base in Allied hands. More importantly, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered losses in experienced pilots that would prove impossible to replace quickly, while the Americans had gained invaluable combat experience that would serve them well in future battles. The human cost of the four-day battle was severe for both sides. The United States Navy lost 543 killed and wounded, most of them from the Lexington's crew, along with 69 aircraft destroyed. The Imperial Japanese Navy suffered 1,070 for casualties and lost 77 aircraft, including many flown by irreplaceable veteran pilots who had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack and subsequent operations across the Pacific, according to the post-war assessment by Japanese naval historians. As documented in the official Japanese Defense Agency war history, the loss of experienced aircrew at Coral Sea began a downward spiral in the quality of Japanese naval aviation that would become critical at Midway and subsequent battles. Perhaps more significantly, the battle had demonstrated that American industrial capacity and pilot training programs were beginning to show results. The USS Yorktown, despite bomb damage that would have sidelined her for months in a peacetime Navy, was repaired at Pearl Harbor in just 72 hours through Herculean efforts by shipyard workers and Navy repair crews. She would fight again at Midway just 4 weeks later. The Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku both required extensive repairs and crew replacement that would keep them out of action for months. This absence of two-thirds of Japan's most experienced carrier force would prove crucial during the upcoming Battle of Midway, where Admiral Yamamoto would be forced to rely on less experienced air groups flying from his remaining carriers. Admiral Nimitz, reviewing the battle reports from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, recognized the strategic victory that had been achieved despite the tactical losses. In his official dispatch to Washington, he wrote, "The Battle of the Coral Sea has demonstrated that our carrier forces can meet and defeat the best the enemy can offer. More importantly, it has saved Australia from invasion and preserved our base for future offensive operations." The battle also marked a fundamental shift in naval warfare that would influence military doctrine. For decades to come, surface ships would never again be the primary arbiters of naval combat. Aircraft carriers, with their ability to strike at distances measured in hundreds of miles rather than dozens, had become the capital ships of the new naval age. The lessons learned in the Coral Sea would be refined and perfected in the battles of Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Light Gulf. For the men who fought in the battle, the experience was transformative. Pilots who had faced combat for the first time learned that they could match skills with Japan's veterans and prevail. Sailors and aircrews who had watched the Lexington sink knew they had witnessed the end of an era and the beginning of something new and terrible in the history of warfare. As the opposing fleets disappeared over opposite horizons, the Coral Sea returned to its peacetime tranquility, but beneath its azure waters lay the wreckage of the Lexington and the Shoho, silent monuments to the first carrier battle in naval history. The age of the aircraft carrier had begun in earnest, and the Pacific War would never be the same. The Battle of the Coral Sea had ended, but its legacy would influence every naval engagement that followed, in stopping the Japanese advance toward Australia and proving that American naval aviation could fight and win against the world's most experienced carrier force. The battle marked the beginning of the end of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. The road to victory would be long and costly, but it had begun in the waters of the Coral Sea on those fateful days in May 1942.